This paper is joint work with Nav Ashraf, Natalie Bao, and Nathan Nunn. And so, I would say, in relationship with the topic of this conference, this paper relates to a body of literature that points out that marriage markets, just as labor markets, are an important source of returns to education. Labor economists were obviously pretty used at attempting to estimate the returns to education in the labor market, but attempting to measure how marriage market outcomes change in response to education, or actually what type of returns can households experience thanks to education in the marriage market, is much harder to observe in a regular context. Of course, there's been a lot of interesting work suggesting, for instance, that in certain times in American history, women's decision to obtain an education was not so much motivated by the expectations of better returns in the labor market, because the female labor force participation was very low. But that's a point that, for instance, Claudia Goldin makes. The returns in the marriage market would really more likely be the drivers of these choices. There's also been work that attempt to look at returns to education using Macri models, so we're going to build on that work. But in our case, we are examining one particular institution that we think allows to observe some of the returns to education in the marriage market in a very direct way. And so we're looking at brideprice, which is a practice that's widespread in many developing countries around the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and in some parts of East Asia. And these are defined as payments from the groom or his family to the family of the bride at the time of marriage. And they're actually relatively large in size, particularly relative to the size of the economics literature that have looked at them, in that these are often payments in excess of 1 year of income, of per capita GDP, or of household income in our sample. The overall goal of this paper is to examine whether these payments can actually promote educational investments by rewarding female education. So that's the main hypothesis. So if you look at the existing characterizations of brideprice, particularly in the policy debate, this is actually a relatively controversial practice. There's been a fair amount of debate over the past, I would say, 10 years about this, whether this custom could be demeaning towards women, maybe lead to coercion, and so on. In fact, I have other work that shows that there's a relationship between this practice and child marriage, for instance. So one example of sort of how heated the debate is that in 2015, the Supreme Court of Uganda was called to rule over whether these payments should be banned in the whole country, which, by the way, did not pass, but it was a much awaited ruling at the time. And this characterization of this payment is somewhat at odds with the way in which instead brideprice is characterized in the ethnographic and anthropological literature, as well as our own experience in the field, in that it is very common to observe both in ethnographic accounts and in first-person accounts that brideprice is often seen as a reward for parents for the investments that they have put in their daughters. And so in this paper, we're attempting to see whether this could be the case and what this would imply in terms of then the endogenous response of parents to the types of rewards that human capital investments may receive in the marriage market. We're going to talk in this paper about the two countries in particular. They're quite different. So we're going to bring evidence from both Indonesia and Zambia that both have a widespread tradition of this payment. Dan, anything? Sorry. So our basic hypothesis is having a brideprice tradition might raise the returns to investing in a daughter's schooling from the point of view of parents. So we're going to have a simple model where the parents are altruistic towards their daughter, but not their altruism towards their daughter is less than 1. And therefore, they obviously will value receiving the bride price themselves more than what returns the daughter herself could accrue in the marriage market. In anticipation to of these returns, parents' decisions to educate their children, actually potentially both daughters and sons, so we have a gender equilibrium, very simple, but a gender equilibrium model, of the decisions of parents of both daughters and sons could be affected by these anticipations. And in terms of how we can think about what the role of this policy, of this institution could be, we also show that the presence of bride price affects also the effectiveness of education policies, because it motivates parents differently, those who have the tradition and those who don't, at taking advantage of expansions in the supply of schools that several developing countries have been undertaking. So we'll look at two examples. To be more specific, we'll start by looking at probably one of the best studied education policy programs in development, which is the IMPRESS program in Indonesia. There was a subject of Esther Duflo's paper in 2001. So that's one of the largest expansion, the supply of schools in the developing world, that built over 60,000 schools across Indonesia. In Esther Duflo's paper, the main focus is men. That's actually the group where effects are concentrated, but we're going to show that if you actually examine what happens to girls that belong to ethnic groups that make these payments, we'll observe responses to the expansion in the supply of schools that are actually larger than the ones that have been documented for men. Do you have a question?
Sorry, just a question. Just to understand the bride price, which I don't really know too much about. What determines the price? In terms of the network that people form, is it mainly only to get the relation with the wife herself? Or does it also create maybe a network with the family? So if the family is well off, etc., you get to kind of buy into their business, etc. Is that also behind the bride price? Or?
Potentially, although I mean, we'll talk a little bit about what historians and anthropologists believe the origins of this practice is. And I would say, for instance, unlike dowry, bride price is typically a payment going from the, as I mentioned, so from the groom side to the bride side in societies where the bride is more likely to move to the family of the groom. So it's actually quite more common both in societies where women move and in societies where women are very productive in agriculture. So that's Esther Boserup's hypothesis from her 1970 book. And when female agriculture is more productive because there's no plow, you're more likely to observe, in fact, bride price payments, because the family of a woman might expect a compensation for parting from basically what's a productive asset. So this is in terms of sort of how we interpret, how the practice is understood by historians and anthropologists. In our model, it's going to be a marriage market transfer. And so as such, it's going to be a function of whatever surplus is created by a given match, which could incorporate characteristics of the business, of family, and so on. But in our model, it will depend on the woman's and on the man's education. So those are going to be the traits that matter. Yes.
In these societies, do the bridegrooms value more educated women?
That's an important question for our setup. And obviously, we start by postulating it, but obviously we were curious about why this would be the case. And so we've done a fair amount. We'll show you some work that we've done by collecting our own data in Zambia about households' beliefs, particularly both asking whether households believe that there is a causal effect of education on these payments, so that do more educated women command higher payments, but also why. And so I'll show you those. Hopefully, if they are not in the main slides. We'll look at the exercise, but primarily, I would say the main motivation has to do with the children's human capital and a little bit with the labor market. Primarily, children's human capital and improvements in health and literacy in the household, which we thought was quite fascinating, as that's certainly something that economists believe. But it's good to hear that households in Lusaka believe that as well. Stephen?
Where does polygamy sit in all this? I thought that at least in its origins, it was more likely in polygynous societies.
There exists a correlation, but it's by no means collinear between the presence of polygyny and the presence of this practice. When you have polygyny, we should expect these payments to be larger. There's work by Michel Tortilt, for instance, also showing that when you have shortages of women, prices would go up. In our data, actually, the majority of couples, depending which data sets we're using, will have mostly monogamous couples in Zambia and a very small minority of polygynous couples in Indonesia. So this is a marriage market. It will be a marriage market, monogamous marriage market. So after just to sort of wrap up the sort of introduction before we dive into the model, everything that we will be doing in Indonesia, we then replicate in a different context in Zambia. And this has to do, I would say, with obviously concerns about whether we can actually isolate the effect of this practice from other traditional practices are correlated with it by looking at a very different context where the historical roots of bride price are quite different. And then also an advantage of the second exercise in Zambia is that we collected some data ourselves, and so we have some survey data that's quite handy helping us interpreting what we see. So I'll give you a bit more of a background about the practice, although I think I anticipated a few things in my answers, and then I will talk about the model. And the way I set it up, since I had an hour, was to as I discuss each prediction of the model, we'll immediately go and look at the corresponding tables or sort of corresponding empirical results, even though that's not how the paper originally was written, but I think it helps keeping track of what's going on. Okay, so just a little bit more of background about what we will mean in our data, in particular when we talk about any groups that engage in bride price. So ethnographers define a actual vector, basically, of different so-called mode of marriages, which are traditional transfers or potentially going in different directions at the time of marriage. And so using sort of what's a very popular data source, at least among economists, which is the Ethnographic Atlas, a database of traditional practices. There are 7 different categories, with bride price being the one most common just in terms of ethnic groups. That doesn't mean at all in terms of population, because obviously India having a much larger population, but few ethnic groups in this data would certainly give us a different answer if we weighted it by population. Bride price is just one of the practices. Obviously, dowry is a very well-known one in economics, but if we look inside the countries where we're working at, there's nobody practicing dowry, and that's important because in our model, we're not going to be thinking about dowry at all. What we're going to be thinking about is whether you have bride price or you have other practices where basically the marriage market surplus, rather than being appropriated by the parents of the bride, remain with the couple. And so these will be cases where there's a gift exchange at the time of marriage, or a so-called token bride price, which is actually quite common in our data, which is a purely symbolic transfer payment or sort of gift, but doesn't have any substantial economic implication. So basically, most of the variation that we will be using is between bride price and these other more minor type of practices. Actually, all of the variation that we use in this paper. And so in the 2 countries that we're studying, so one is Indonesia. We've aggregated at the province level the fraction of people that belong to an ethnic group that, according to this database, the Ethnographic Atlas, traditionally engage in bride price payments. And as you see, there's a fair amount of geographic variation. And we will talk a little bit about sort of potential reasons for this, but as you might guess, a lot has to do with the discussion we were having earlier. So the potential confounds could be the role of women in agriculture and whether women go and live with the family of their husband upon marriage. We do a similar exercise in Zambia, so as you see, there's a fair amount of geographic clustering, but it's by no means sort of concentrated only in one region of the country.
Sorry, where do you get these data?
So this is
super finely articulated.
maybe, well, I have a description of the data, so maybe that's going to be useful. And in fact, these tables come from merging of different sources, but in fact, sort of a big chunk of the exercise had to do with putting together different sources of data. So we have ethnicity level data from the ethnographic atlas validated with some additional sources, where say the ethnographic atlas is the vast majority of the ethnic level data. That's going to give us an identifier for an ethnic group, which is for presence in either because of the group itself or because of the language that ethnic group speaks, can allow us to match what the basically ancestors of the respondents to these surveys were doing at the time when the ethnographic atlas was the sources of the ethnographic atlas were compiled. And so for Indonesia, we used the 1995 intercensal data. There's a vast survey that's the same that Duflo uses in her exercise. We then repeat it with the 2010 census, though. We merge that data with these data on the expansion, the supply of schools. And then we use another survey, which is Indonesia Family Life Survey from 2000 and 2007. So those would be rounds 3 and 4, because that's one of the few sources, in fact, in the literature that gives us data on actual bride price payment, how much was paid, and so we can merge that with contrast that with characteristics of men and women. For Zambia, the main survey data set that we use are the demographic and health surveys, and we use 4 different waves, and that's because we're using data on the construction of large expansion in the supply of schools that was promoted by the Japanese aid agency using data from the Ministry of Education that we obtained, and most of the expansion happened around the year 2000. And so, so these 4 surveys kind of surround this episode. In addition to that, we have some data that we collected ourselves as part of a larger effort to look at actually fertility preferences and determine various family economics questions. And so these are the main sources. So the tables, the figures that I showed you earlier, are basically looking at the concentration within these 2 survey data sets of people that can be matched to the Murdoch ethnographic atlas and that engage in bride price payments. So this is the big overview, but I thought it's useful to have it all in one slide, but then I'll tell you more as we go into the results. So I'll start talking about our model and the setup, and I think that's going to make also more clear where the sort of the various pieces are fitting in. So we have a simple 2-period model. In the first period, parents decide whether or not to educate their children. In the second period, the children match in a frictionless marriage market. So this is, I mean, the sort of this part of the model is actually very close to, for instance, Chiapuri, Igun, and Weiss, their 2009 AER paper. But I would say the important difference compared to the literature is that in our case, the bride price payment is, for households that practice it, the marriage market transfer. So we have perfectly transferable utility, but the payment, basically the share of the surplus that is appropriated by the bride, the female side of the market, belongs to the bride's parents if they engage in bride price payments. And so to some extent, then the bride price serves 2 roles. One is a marriage market clearing transfer, but also an intergenerational transfer from the younger generation to the older. So the young couple gets married, accrues a marital surplus, and the share of surplus is appropriated by the parents of the bride. So in equations, we have the problem of a woman's parents is one of choosing the schooling of the daughter, which could be 0 or 1. So we have a simple dichotomic choice. They have just linear utility over their own consumption over the 2 periods with discounting. But then they're also altruistic towards their daughters. So that's a parameter gamma, captures the daughter's, the altruism towards the daughter. So it's important the gamma is strictly less than 1. Otherwise, basically, all the conditions that I'm going to show you will actually have equality. So it's an important component of the problem. The daughter could accrue some utility from getting educated, utility or disutility, and so that's the main source of heterogeneity for whether the daughter goes to school or not. And then in the second period, the daughter will have some utility, which is a function of whether the household belongs to an ethnic group that practices brideprice. This is index. This is quite important. Now you're going to see it in all the regressions. So when this indicator is equal to 1, you are at the top of that table that I showed you earlier in terms of marriage market practices. And then obviously depends on her education. There's a budget constraint, so the parents will pay some cost of education if the daughter goes to school. But then if they belong to any group that engages in bride price payments, they will receive this payment, which, as we'll see, was actually determined endogenously in the marriage market. So this is the woman's problem. The man's problem is it's very similar. So the parents' problem is similar. I would say the main difference is that it is the son. Actually, things can be accommodated to think about what happens if it were the parents, but it is the son who's going to pay the bride price, and so it enters his utility function, the fact that this payment exists. Obviously, the parents will still care about the presence of this custom because they are altruistic towards their son as well. And so just for notation, P is the education of a man as opposed to S, which is the education of a woman. And delta is the altruism as opposed to gamma when you have a son. So it's actually not essential for this altruism parameter to be different, but it's going to sustain a particular equilibrium. So you could allow for some preferences, although it's not necessary. This type of framework potentially accommodates actually having multiple children, given that you have linear utility. The problems of the different children are separable, as long as you don't have credit constraints. But this is sort of quite stripped down education decision. Okay, now basically we can think about where these continuation utilities for sons and daughters are going to come from, and that's the marriage market. So the main marriage market has 2 main elements. The first one is there's going to be just to simplify, so 2 ethnic groups or 2 types of ethnic groups. Those that make bride price payments and those that don't, and there is no intermarriage. That's consistent with what we see in our data. There's a fair amount of intermarriage between the sort of between each ethnic group, but almost no intermarriage between groups that make these payments and groups that don't. We also assume there's an identical mass of men and women on each side of the market. So now, obviously, to define what the characteristics of the marriage market are, I'm going to tell you sort of what determines the surplus, and in that, as I mentioned earlier, we're following Chiapporigun and Weiss, and so there's going to be a value that men and women accrue if they remain single, and that's going to be a function of their respective education. So any change in your value as single that's caused by education is a labor market return to education. This could be just a definition, or anything that is not related basically to marriage. There is, in addition, also a marital output that gets produced by the match between a man and a woman as a function of their education. So that's it's the only characteristic that matters in this marriage market. So the marital surplus is then going to be the difference between the marital output and the values that each spouse can accrue as single. Then we make very classic assumptions in this literature. The first one is that marital surplus is increasing in the education of either spouse, so the household is better off if either one of the two spouses is more educated. So going back to the other question, this is assumed to be true also for a woman's education, but obviously then it's not may not be obvious to everyone, and so it's useful to see where at least our respondents agree. Probably less in Oko's assumption, but obviously very common and very important in the assignment literature is that of complementarity. That's going to generate positive assortative matching in our data. That is that the match between two educated men and two educated spouses and two uneducated spouses is more productive than a match between two mixes. And so that's obviously Shapley-Shubik in 72 and Becker in 1973 have shown us sort of that we can basically obtain positive assortative matching from this type of complementarity in the marital surplus. The last assumption is actually not essential, but it's useful because it's not, actually marriage rates are very high in our data, and it's not that relevant for our question. We assume that even a match between two uneducated people is larger than zero, meaning everybody wants to marry in equilibrium. And so last couple of definition things, and then we can get to the action. As I mentioned earlier, the difference between the value as single of an educated woman versus uneducated, and same for men, is a labor market return to education. And then the marital surplus, which is a function of the education of the spouses, will be divided between man and woman, and the shares are going to be endogenously given by the marriage market. So we're going to call, following Chiapporigon and Weiss, the returns to education in the marriage market as the difference between the share of surplus that a woman obtains when she's educated relative to when she's not, and same thing for the man. So if you look at the total return then that a woman obtains from getting married, there will be a return in the labor market, and if she does not belong to an ethnic group that makes bride price payment, she also obtains a marriage market return. The assumption is then that the bride price is actually the return to education of the woman. Basically, it's the parents that can appropriate this marriage market return. So it's an intergenerational contract that allows the parents to potentially say veto the match unless they can receive the match. I think Stephen and then Eliana.
Can marriages dissolve?
Not in this model.
Is this a commitment device so that the husband mistreats the wife? She goes back and
the payment. No, so no. Okay, so this is a case where the payment goes from the man to the woman, right? So
so her parents hold the money, and if she's mistreated, she goes back
and they can still keep the money. So I think, in fact, what's more, so divorce is not that, it was traditionally obviously not that common, but nowadays it is much more. For instance, in Uganda, when the Supreme Court ruled that that the payment could not be banned, it was also decided that it would be a payment that the family of the woman could keep. And so that would give women more freedom to leave an unsuccessful marriage. That was probably a bigger potential source of concern, but there is variation. Basically, there's no one rule.
Associated with signaling, in other words, the demonstration that the groom's family is prosperous or he has potential is.
There's, potentially so for sure, in the sense, if you think about the way even in which these payments are decided in Zambia. I know the Zambian context much better because I've done a fair amount of field work there. And you will have negotiation ceremonies where each side of the family comes together, except the bride. But the groom will be there with some various uncles that specialize in negotiating, and then they will start listing the virtues of this woman and come to an agreement. So while I think there might be other considerations, it seems that in the field, at least in my experience, this narrative is not so far from what's going on. Eliana.
Sorry, can you explain again? You're saying that if the family doesn't receive the bride price, then the transfer goes to the woman, to the young bride.
Exactly. So it's basically an intra-household allocation difference.
My sense is that it would actually stay either with the groom's family or with the groom himself, because that's typically wealth that's been accumulated before the marriage.
So this
I
is
don't
the
think-
marital surplus that it gets accumulated, not that gets paid off. So obviously this is just a 2-period game, so you don't have the whole solution. But imagine basically you could, and we actually think that this has a lot to do then with the welfare debate about whether women are worse off or better off, which is a bit abstract from what we're doing, in the sense we can't quantitatively get that answer. But basically one idea is, if the parents were not taking this payment, the woman might have more bargaining in the household. So typically bargaining power in the household. And so that's typically how in these marriage market models, the division of the surplus takes place. Now that is a possibility in a static, and in fact in a static setup, women are worse off because of this practice, because they cannot partake in the marital surplus. In a dynamic way, though, they might get more investments, and so if the labor market returns to education are large enough, they might actually be better off. But this payment is not, say, an inheritance, and this way it's quite different from, say, Botticini and Xiao's view of dowry. It's a marriage market transfer, which basically the division of the value of that match taking place. And so if it's not, someone has to own it, and in the absence of this practice, the side that would be offered to clear the marriage market to the woman would be her intra-household allocation. Okay, so these are just basically definitions, so then we can get into the predictions and look at them in the data, and I should be doing reasonably well on time, so feel free to ask any questions if something is not clear. So, as I mentioned earlier, there is a first prediction that's actually that stems directly from the literature, but it's actually quite important, because obviously it's not obvious that the presence of bride price would not alter things. But we know from the assignment literature that when you have complementarity in the types in the marital surplus, a stable equilibrium would be the one that maximizes aggregate surplus. So it means basically you want to always match the high productivity types together and the low productivity types together. And that would generate stability, meaning no two people would be better off by breaking up and marrying someone else or being single. The intuition is I think, very simple and very appealing. Obviously, if two educated people are more productive, together a low-educated person could never outbid the more educated one by offering a higher transfer, because the match would not be sufficiently productive to make it incentive compatible for him to make such a proposal. So in our particular setup, what would a positive assortative matching generate? Well, you'll typically have higher rates of education among men than women. And so that's something that we postulate, and then I'm going to tell you under which condition that can be an equilibrium. But when you have more men than women educated, there's only one stable equilibrium, whether or not you have bride price, and that's one in which everyone marries, and educated women only marry educated men. So the basic prediction is that we should see that matching is a positive assortative by education. That's something pretty general in the data, not in our context. But what's important is the presence of bride price should not change that degree of assortativeness. So we shouldn't see that because there is bride price, for instance, more, say, low-educated men can buy their way into marrying a more educated woman, because it would just be too expensive. They would not want to do it. Yes?
Where does lifetime fecundity function to this? Basically, that would vary by the age of the bride, and that would probably be negatively related after a degree to education.
Well, so this is a 2-period model, right? So obviously we're not thinking about, the heterogeneity is coming only in the education of a woman. And when we talk about what we mean by education, this is primary school. So when we get into the data, we're looking at primary school, which is actually, as we'll see, it's not at all universal yet in our time period. So we have, I think, at most around 67% primary school completion among the women in Zambia, for example. And so we're not yet at an education level where the trade-off between fecundity and education kicks in. There's a really nice paper by Corinne Law that thinks about that in the US. but she's thinking about getting an MBA or a PhD, which is so very far from what's going on here.
I was just thinking that even the later degrees of education would necessarily be correlated with the primary education and how that would interact. Right?
Sorry, the returns to
after
education.
primary education, secondary education, you would need the primary education to go on there,
Sure.
and then there would be through that channel it should be correlated.
Yeah, so in fact, when I talk about primary school I'm just talking about primary school completion, not stopping in primary school. And in fact, I'm going to show you, though, that in some predictions, we can actually show strict monotonicity at all levels of education, meaning, for instance, when we say the bride price goes up with a woman's education, that's monotonic in our data. Even if you get in Zambia, we don't have college graduates in our sample, but in Indonesia, we do. Even if a college degree, there's still a higher bride price being paid at that point. Dan?
Yeah, you had heterogeneity on I don't remember if it's also the boys' part, but the girls' part.
Yeah.
Does that generate any extra surplus in the match, or is it?
No. So that simplifies things greatly. It's only a utility of getting educated in the first period. That's what, it could be done, but it would make things more complex if that would be a trait as well.
And would that kind of heterogeneity sort of break down the? I don't think it does.
I don't think it would. In fact, I think though that law paper that I was describing earlier allows for a continuous trait to then sort of very discontinuously make a human capital very discontinuous in addition to the educational investment. But this separability makes, because obviously, when you have pre-matching investments, you have to worry about multiple equilibria and so on, unless you have a relatively simple framework like this one. So, all right, so let me just show simply in the data. As a simple prediction, basically we relate the probability that a woman has completed primary school as a function of whether the husband, vice versa. We relate that to the dependent variable, which is whether the husband has completed primary school, and we interact that with whether the woman belongs to a bride price ethnic groups, and also a wide array of controls. What's very important, in addition to bride price, we always include interactions that have to do with these potential additional confounds, like polygyny, for example, or female agriculture. These are what we call ethnicity controls, matrilocality, and so on. So we attempt to isolate the relationship between bride price and these other variables, obviously knowing that there are still potential sources of confound. So that's the first prediction. As you see, is true in 2 of our data sets in Indonesia, and actually in Zambia. It's also true in our for a second data set in Zambia, but that one's very small, which is our own survey. There's the second prediction that comes out from this model has to do with how the marriage market returns to education, which could be just intra-household allocations, basically, or bride price might respond to education. Are these returns positive or negative? So basically, when you have this assortative mating, you're going to have 3 types of marriages that can take place. Both are educated, the man is educated and the woman is not, or both are educated. You're not going to have any match where an educated woman marries an uneducated man, and that's because educated women are on the short side of the market, and so the educated men should want to outbid the uneducated man by offering more, and so that would not be stable. So then you can simply differentiate these stability conditions to obtain how the share of surplus that men and women obtain in the marriage market varies with education. And you'll find that, one thing that's important is that there is no superscript or subscript E, so there's no ethnic level variation in these returns. Simply what's going to happen is that the return to education will be the entire bride price, but it will not be different according to what ethnic group you depend on, because basically you haven't affected the stability conditions in the marriage market. Basically, you'll have the women share of marital surplus will vary according to education. So the difference basically between the one they obtain when they're educated and when they're not is the contribution of a woman's education to a match with an educated man. So they appropriate basically the entire gain that they provide to the household by being educated, and not just due to the fact that they're on the short side of the market, so they can get all of that surplus. So the sort of long discussion for a very simple prediction, though, that in equilibrium, educated women will command a higher bride price payment. Obviously, this is a tricky thing to estimate, and I'm a labor economist, so I'm happy to discuss all the caveats on this. So you should see these as serial regressions that suffer from all the biases that one could imagine observing in the labor market, and that's why we have surveys to the households where we asked about their opinions as well. But at least correlationally, we felt this was still quite informative, given that there's basically no evidence. There was no evidence of this type of relationship, to the best of our knowledge, prior to this paper. So when the dependent variable is the log bride price amount, and we regress that against a vector of, well, female characteristics and also male characteristics, as well as age, anything that we can find about socioeconomic status of the parents, and so on, and characteristics of the local marriage market, we find that a woman's education strictly increases the amount of payment that the household receives. So for instance, if you have, so in the more conservative estimates, if you've completed primary school, your bride price payment is 23% higher, then you get an additional 35%. Again, I mean, I should be careful with the causal language here, but sort of the payment is 35% higher for women who have secondary school, junior secondary, and then senior secondary, and that's true actually quantitatively also in Zambia, although we have less variation, so things are, and a very small data set. This is the one that we collected ourselves. Given concerns about endogeneity of women's education, with the obvious question of, well, do simply more able women command higher payment and more desirable in the marriage market, but there's no actual causal effect, we instrument female education with the supply of schools in Indonesia, which in our model is a valid instrument, in the sense it can be excluded from the man's education, and we do find still a positive relationship between, a very strong, in fact, positive effect of primary school on the amount of bride price that's paid. That's true in the IFLS and in our survey in Zambia. Yeah?
So maybe I misunderstand this, but why, on the previous slide, why do the more educated men have to pay more for a woman next to for?
Because the educated woman is in high demand, because she produces this additional surplus in the marriage. And I'll tell you how we interpret that in our survey that was coming up. And so he needs to offer a higher transfer to convince her to marry him rather than, say, an uneducated man.
But doesn't the regression show that the educated man needs to pay more conditional on who the woman is?
Yeah, so in fact, well, this is actually only true in Indonesia, and it's not true in Zambia. In fact, in our prediction is that there should not be a relationship between a man's education and the bride price paid. One explanation, in fact, we talk at length about that in the paper, is obviously education is one trait in the marriage market. There's potentially others. One possibility is, in addition to education, beauty or health and so on should be rewarded in the marriage market. So if the more high quality men attract better women, they're going to have to pay more for those unobserved, for those traits that we do not observe. And we have some evidence of that in the paper, in the sense we show that more educated men marry healthier women, conditional on how educated they are, and so on. So that could explain some of these patterns, although arguably, admittedly, it is outside of our theoretical framework. Yes?
This could be ethnographically obviable, but are you able to control for the wife's parents' characteristics?
Well, not to a limited extent. I think we have some questions in the IFLS about how much wealth your parents had at the time of marriage, which could be very noisy, and also make our sample size go down substantially, because I think it's asking only one wave, but we do control for that. And I think in Zambia we have a simple 0-1 question: is your family more higher socioeconomic status than the one of your husband? Not framed exactly that way, but a question of that sort, and we include those as well. So yes, we do what we can in that respect.
And that makes the parameter go down, as I can see?
Well, let me see. It should certainly, I mean, the expectation is that it should attenuate it. Yeah, I don't think, although we can rule out that they are the same, but certainly these. But I think in some cases they do. And yes, it attenuates the estimates, which again would be in line with the idea that more educated, wealthier families are more likely to educate their kids and maybe have higher marital surplus and therefore would have higher payments.
Well, I was also thinking in terms of Professor Durloff's comment earlier about like the family status driving analysis, that you just want to marry to a family of higher status, and families of higher status make their children be educated.
Yeah, potentially, absolutely. Now, obviously, the question is sort of how would that interact? It would be interesting, in fact, potentially to see how that interacts with education. One could think of a continuum of types where education is one of the things that makes you more appealing. And I think the framework should be preserved, but it would be certainly more complex because of the premarital investment stage. Okay, so, well, in fact, I said that I was doing well on time. Now I need to be more cognizant, but I'll tell you briefly about this because I think it's actually quite interesting. So we asked people about what factors they think determine, what are the most important factors in determining bride price, and education is the most commonly listed factor. There's a number of others, but wealth was actually not a particularly popular answer. And then when we asked them, why do you think educated women command higher bride price payments? First we asked them to give us an unprompted answer, and we just had the surveyor record it, and then we sort of classified it ourselves, and then we read out a number of options as well. And so, what's interesting is how the response answers in that basically when you ask people, why do you think bride price is higher, everybody unpromptedly says, well, of course, the parents spent all that money to educate their daughter. They deserve to be compensated, which obviously is makes a lot of sense, except that might not work in equilibrium. But then once we prompt them for why, we prompt them sort of for these potential reasons, there's still support for ideas about sort of improving the literacy of the children and so on. So obviously this is not sort of super strong evidence, but I think it points in the direction of the fact that people have some valuation for the skills that a woman brings in the household. Okay, now let's get to the sort of most important predictions that are tied to the educational decision and to the elasticity with respect to expansions in the supply of schools. So you can solve, once you know what the equilibrium value that women obtain from the return that women obtain for education in the labor and marriage market, you can have an expression for what's the cutoff ability that justifies educating a woman. That's the source of education. And so basically a woman will be educated if her ability is greater than a certain threshold. And what's important, this threshold depends on the bride price or not. And what's important, as I mentioned earlier, is the altruism. So the intuition is basically when you have a bride price payment, the parents themselves accrue the return in the marriage market. And so if they're not fully altruistic, they prefer to accrue it themselves rather than knowing that return sits with their daughter. And so the threshold will actually be higher, meaning there'll be fewer women educated when there is no bride price. So the simple prediction is that the probability that a girl will be educated is higher among ethnicities that engage in bride price payments as opposed to other ethnicities. We also have an auxiliary prediction, because since we have test scores, we can look at indeed whether the average ability of educated women differs across ethnic groups, which would simply mean that the threshold is a different one.
So why do you need altruism here for this prediction?
So remember, if the marriage market payment is given always in our model to the bride side. In one case, the bride keeps it; it's her intra-household allocation. In the other case, it's appropriated by the parents. So if altruism is perfect. So if parents are completely indifferent over whether they get cash for themselves or if the daughter has more resources in her marriage, then they don't care. You see. But I don't think this is pushing. In fact, there's a pretty vast literature starting. In fact, we quoted even sort of Gary Becker's Nobel lecture, sort of asking, well, if efficient level of education might depart from the ones a parent choose, as long as you have even a small level of imperfect altruism. Stephen, do you have a question? Or?
Maybe it's a digression, but is there any issue of the liquidity of the price empirically?
I have another paper about about that. In the sense I'm sort of thinking about that.
All these papers, sorry.
No. But in this model, no. But it's true that potentially, parents need to men need to come up with the money, and that could be delaying or anticipating marriage and so on. Oh, sorry.
Whether the price was in the form of land versus cash.
It depends.
And is there illiquidity in the sense that the object that you give, the other side can't liquidate? Is that?
Yeah, I think so this practice is very heterogeneous. There is evidence that in some societies it's cattle, and in some cases cattle that's only used for that purpose. Certainly this again transcends the scope of the model, but there's a lot of interesting variation. Okay, so let me show you. So empirically, we look at various sources of data again, including both in terms of education rates and test scores, controlling for the various ethnic controls that I mentioned, as well as various geographic cohort effects and so on, and sort of broadly find, first of all, that education rates are significantly higher, although not by large magnitudes. In fact, in the paper, we contrast these magnitudes to those of conditional cash transfer programs, and we're not that far away if you believe what the returns to education of these payments might be. So levels of education are higher from 2 to 4 percentage points, depending on the data set, the time period, and context. But actually, this is a very small data set in Lusaka, but it turns very high apparently in this small sample, but not statistically significant. And then also test scores for brideprice girls tend to be lower, meaning less able girls are allowed still to obtain an education in anticipation of the higher returns that they might receive. Let's get now to sort of what's potentially what was sort of the most important prediction of the model in terms of its empirical implications. Now let's think that what happens when you decrease the cost of schooling. You have basically different thresholds of ability that justify educating a daughter. So, and this is something I should have mentioned. Let's assume a unimodal distribution of ability. Let's think about sort of the non-brideprice girls will require a higher threshold of education to justify of ability to justify the investment than the rest of the girls. When you decrease the cost of schooling, you could be bringing in a different amount of women depending on what ethnic group you belong to. And now in economies where education rates are low, this could imply that the girls with the higher education rates are also responding more to the expansion of school construction. Obviously, that depends basically whether you're to the left or to the right of the mode, but here we are, as I mentioned, sort of relatively low education rates. And in fact, it's actually pretty common. For instance, we often see men being more educated and responding more. So that's not so unusual. But the main prediction will be we should expect this practice to matter for how people respond to policies as well. And so to test this prediction, we use data from the INPRESS program, this same school expansion program in the 1970s on Esther Duflo, analyzed as we confirm the findings from one paper that she has with a co-author, as well as other work that suggests that on aggregate there's no effect on female education. But if you look at girls that belong to brideprice ethnic groups, the effect is actually quite sizable. And that's true even, for a battery of, obviously all the controls interact with brideprice as Esther Duflo uses, as well as allowing for all the additional ethnic characteristics to be interacted with the school construction. So this is the case for Indonesia. So basically the idea in the Duflo paper, just to clarify, maybe some of you, I imagine most of you are very familiar with it, is basically there's cohorts that were too old to benefit from the expansion of schools and cohorts that were young enough. And so when we plot the age at the time of the construction of schools, the younger cohorts are the ones in brideprice groups are the only ones that exhibit an increase in their education rates. We do a similar exercise for Zambia with some caveats because the variation is not as nice, but still finds very similar behaviors, meaning basically no effect of increasing the supply of schools for girls on average, but a very significant and strong effect among girls that belong to these ethnic groups. Last thing, that's what was sort of useful about having this equilibrium framework is what happens to the boys. And so what's if you remember how we characterized, so how we solved for the returns to education for the men, the man basically doesn't care if he's making the payment to the woman or if he's making the payment to her parents. And in that, if so long as the brideprice is a marriage market transfer from the male side of the marriage market, it doesn't matter whether that practice exists or not. It does not affect matching patterns, etc. And so we should expect that all these patterns that we document for women should not hold for men. That's a prediction of the model, and also I think reassures us, if this is true, that we're not picking up some systematic difference in how certain societies value education in general or their wealth and so on. And so we show, once we allow for controls for Muslims, which was the only sort of one case in the intercensal data, we find no effect of male education no relationship between male education and this practice. Even we can't detect any statistical difference between non-brideprice and brideprice groups in the response to expansions of schools. Sorry, also the test scores are statistically the same. One last thing to sort of to close the model is when would all of this be sustainable in equilibrium? What you need to have for the story to make sense is you still want to have more men than women being educated in equilibrium, both before and after the expansion of school. Because that's sort of the basic assumption that characterizes the model. And so in our model, that would happen if altruism towards sons was higher than those around daughter, or if returns in the marriage market, in the labor market were higher for sons than for daughters. That's pretty digestible. Either of these would need to be true, or if there's differential returns in the marriage market. So if you have any of these three conditions, then you can sustain this as a unique, what I've described so far, as a unique equilibrium in the marriage market. So, yes.
Do you know if there's a lot of practice of, pardon my ignorance, of dowry payments as opposed
in the data or no?
Yes, in the settings you're studying.
So
you're considering the alternative no payments, right? And how would that change if the alternative was actually dowry?
So certainly in our data, so in Indonesia, there's even a question in the IFLS, and so there's only one ethnic group that practices dowry, so we don't include it. It's very small. In Zambia, to the best of our knowledge, nobody practices. We don't even ask, actually. I imagine if one, say, sampled households of Indian origin, that might be quite, oversamples those, that would be quite interesting, but it's fair. So there's one thing that's very important that I haven't, in the interest of time, I did not include, but it's all detailed, it's in painful detail in the paper, is two things that are very important. So one is, we show that historical brideprice practice predicts modern behavior. Not so much in terms of whether you make a payment or not, because almost everybody makes a payment, but it has a large implication on how big the payment is. And so you go from 3% of per capita GDP to 50% of per capita GDP, for instance. And then the other thing that we spend a lot of time documenting in the paper is other types of behaviors, such as wealth, fertility, and so on, do not systematically vary according to these. So that's obviously very, very important. Okay, 20 seconds, but I have my concluding remarks. It goes so fast that it makes me... All right, so to conclude, we show that there appears to be substantial returns to education in the marriage market as captured by the bride price. In fact, when we look at what this means quantitatively, higher payments by about 12% of per capita GDP will raise education, primary school completion by 2 percentage points. So it's not completely outside of the ballpark of the CCT literature. And it seems that these payments actually function as intergenerational transfers. So parents account for them in their educational decisions. And so maybe intergenerational reciprocity, anticipating payments basically could encourage parents to invest in their children. And last, understanding how these practices work can help us evaluate in the evaluation or in the design of policies, because their effectiveness might be made or broken by the presence of certain practices. That's no, I know that you have a flight to catch. So that's it for the paper. Obviously, I'm happy to take more questions.
Any consumption questions on, you would predict women operating in environments without right prices would consume more than women?
Yeah, so we've looked a little bit at that.
Yeah.
And the correlation was in most specification, but the data is extremely noisy. Yeah. And there is a sort of a deeper question about, in fact, maybe we need a completely different data set. But there's a big question, so how do you measure empowerment or distribution of consumption in the household, right? It's very hard to do. So the DHS has questions like, who decides about who makes purchases, and often these have been shown to be, the answers to these type of questions have been shown to have some predictive value. But in general, what one would really like to have is good intra-household allocation data. That's very complex to collect, and so there's little data about that.
I'm trying to think. Stoves?
Pardon?
The presence of gas stoves.
Oh, yeah. Well, I could take maybe the DHS will have some data about that, and that's all sort of things that sort of make basically you need something attributable that certainly makes the woman better off, strictly better off, and so that's. There's actually a great literature that studies how you can go from one good into a whole bundle. So Arthur Lubel and co-authors, but there's it requires unfortunately not in our data it would not be possible because we don't have clothing or other things. But maybe in a separate data set, something more could be done. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thanks.